Hey guys, and welcome to part 2 of our unit on energetics of marine ecosystems. In this video, we're going to be specifically looking at energy flow along food chains. So if you remember from part 1, we really focused on the first part of our food chain down here, and that was how do we get our energy from a source, whether it's chemical energy or light energy, and get it fixed by our producers through the process of photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. What we're really going to focus on this video is then what happens to that energy as it moves throughout the rest of our ecosystem, from producers to the various types of consumers. So our essential question, we have two of them today. One is what happens to energy as it moves through a food chain and how can it be calculated? So we'll take a look at energy loss and calculating the energy that's lost along the way. And also how can food chains be represented as pyramids of energy, numbers, and biomass? So we'll take a look at some diagrams of representing what's happening to populations, energies, and biomass along the way. So just to review, if you remember, last video we talked about this concept of productivity, and we said that productivity was a measurement of the rate of production of biomass, the amount of livable tissue or living tissue per unit area per year. So we were able to kind of express that one of two ways. We could talk about how many grams, so how many grams of living tissue per meter squared per year. Just remember that a negative in the exponent means per, so we could say grams per meter squared per year, or we could also talk about how many units of energy are being captured per meter squared per year. If we were to take a look at this little diagram, productivity can be influenced by various factors. So you notice that the productivity, which is shown in dark green, as the calendar is rolling forward here from month to month, kind of oscillates or switches between the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. You'll notice that in our summer months, a lot of that productivity is up in the northern hemisphere. That's because there's plenty of light, warm temperatures. But then during our winter, it shifts to the southern hemisphere, and that's because they have more light, warmer temperatures. So things like temperature, the amount of light availability, the amount of carbon dioxide, all these things can affect the productivity, which will then therefore affect the rest of the food chain. Now, when we talk about energy flow, a lot of that energy is not going to make it from level to level. So if we were to start, let's say, with primary production, with our photosynthetic organisms or our autotrophs here, let's take a look at what happens to some of that energy right in the beginning. Let's say that our sun here is giving off 8 million arbitrary units of energy. An arbitrary unit is just a measurement of energy. Now, I would expect that if all that energy is going to be sent to my producers, I should find that they get 8 million units of energy as well. But that's not the case. And that's because about 99% of the energy that comes from our sun is actually not captured by plants. Some of that energy is going to just simply be reflected. So the surface of the water might reflect it so the plant doesn't get it. The plant itself might reflect it. If you remember, when you see plants that are green, you're actually seeing the green wavelengths of light being reflected back to you. So a lot of that energy is going to be reflected and not captured. Some more energy might be absorbed, let's say, by the surface of the water. So not all that plant at the bottom is not going to get all that light energy because the particles in the water itself will absorb some of it. And then last but not least, the energy that does reach it might actually just pass right through. So in order for a photon to be used for photosynthesis, it has to hit that chloroplast. If it doesn't, it'll just simply pass through. So what we find is that only about 1% of the energy that's sent from the sun is captured by our primary producers, or this phytoplankton here. What we call that energy that's actually used for photosynthesis, so that 1%, we call that the gross primary production, or GPP. That's just the total amount of energy that is used and captured by photosynthesis. Now, some of that energy is now also going to be lost because the plant is going to use some of it. Remember that plants need to grow, they need to reproduce, they need to divide, they have to do chemical reactions, so they're going to use some of that through the process of cellular respiration. So if we were to take the GPP and subtract R, or respiration, what we're left with is something called the net primary production, or NPP. That's going to be the actual amount of energy that's available to the next trophic level. So a simple formula is just that the net primary production, the amount of energy available to the next trophic level, is equal to GPP, the amount that was actually captured by the plant or the organism, minus R, whatever it used for respiration. And that's really going to be our starting point, is the NPP. So let's say that, hypothetically, our phytoplankton here is starting with an NPP, or net primary production, of 92,000 arbitrary units. Now that energy is going to transfer to our next trophic level, let's say the zooplankton here, our primary consumer. Now, is it going to also have 92,000 units of energy as well? And you might be familiar with the answer to that question is no. Well, why not? Let's take a look at some of the reasons why energy is lost along food chains. One main reason is that some of that organism is not going to be consumed. Organisms don't always consume 100% of whatever they're eating. It might be hard to imagine at this level, but imagine a lion eating a gazelle. Some of the scraps are going to be left behind, which might be eaten by a decomposer or another organism like a scavenger. Some of that energy is also, just like the plant did, is going to be released as heat from respiration. So this organism, this krill here, needs to use that energy for its own living, its reproduction, its movement. So some of that will be released as heat. And then also some of that energy or some of that biomass will just be excreted in urine, so passing out those wastes, or egested through feces. Will just pass right through its digestive tract. So not all the energy is actually going to be stored inside this organism. What we find is only about 10% of that energy is going to be stored inside my next level. So if I were to take 10% of 92,000, I could just move the decimal to the left one or multiply it by 0.10. And what I find is that about 9,200 arbitrary units are now left for my secondary consumer. So something you're probably familiar with is that we have like an energy pyramid, or a pyramid of energy that shows how energy is decreasing as we move through the food web. We start with 100%, then we only have 10%, 1%, 0.1, and then 0.01. And that's because, again, that energy is being lost as heat through respiration, as well as just not being consumed or going to waste. This is why we only have typically about 4 or 5 trophic levels in any food chain. It's because there's just not enough energy to support the people at the top, or the organisms at the top. So another way we can look at this in a pyramid of energy are using these blocks. And you should be able to look at how much energy is moving through level to level and calculate what actual percent moved on. So let's take a look at an example here in Silver Springs, Florida. When they surveyed this area, they found that in their producers, let's say about 20,810 kcals of energy, kcal is another measurement of energy, was inside these producers. That was their net primary production. And when they measured the primary consumers, they found that only about 3,368 units of energy were stored inside them. So if I were to ask you what percent of energy moved from producer to primary consumer, you should be able to calculate that. The way we do that is simply we can take our amount of energy that was successfully stored, 3,368, and we can divide that by how much originally had, 20,810. And then if I multiply that by 100, I get my total percentage that was transferred. So go ahead and pause the video and give this a shot, and let's see what you get. Now, if you did pause the video, what you should find is that 16% of that energy moved. Now, if I were to ask you what percent was lost, we could take that and subtract it from 100, and we find that only 84% was actually lost to the environment through respiration and through waste. At the secondary consumer, we might find that only 383 kcals of energy transferred. Again, you should be able to calculate that, so go ahead and pause it and see what you get. What you should have found was that about 11% of that energy transferred, which means 89% was lost, and hopefully you're catching on. Let's say my tertiary consumers only had 21 kcals of energy per meter squared per year. If I were to calculate what percentage moved from my secondary consumer, I'd find that only about 5%, which means 95% was lost. So you should be really familiar with how to calculate this simply by taking the part, dividing it by what was originally there, and then multiplying that by 100. Now, another way we can look at these pyramids are at pyramids of biomass and pyramids of numbers. And what you notice is we see the same sorts of trends. If I were to look at the biomass of, let's say, this coral reef, I notice that the biomass is getting less and less through my pyramid as I move on. Again, just like energy is being lost, mass is being lost because you're releasing carbon as carbon dioxide. Some of that waste is coming out through egestion and excretion, so we're finding less and less biomass as we move through. Also, populations tend to decrease as you move from the bottom levels to the top. We find that those pyramids get narrower and narrower because there's not enough energy to support the organisms at the top. So you should be really familiar with how to construct these pyramids that show what happens to not just energy, but biomass and population sizes as we move from level to level. Now, one last thing I wanted to hit on was, can we have inverted pyramids? In other words, is it possible to have our lower levels be smaller than the upper levels? And the answer to that question is yes, it is possible, but only with pyramids of biomass and pyramids of numbers. So imagine that this here was a pyramid of biomass. How is it possible that the producers have less biomass than the consumers that eat them? Well, one way, let's say these were phytoplankton. Phytoplankton reproduce really quickly. So at any one time, I might measure the biomass and find that it's really, really small, but because they divide so quickly and reproduce, they're able to sustain the higher level of biomass above them. So just reproduction rate might allow for a smaller amount of biomass at any one time. If this was a pyramid of numbers, I could also find that my producers have a smaller amount than my consumers. Imagine if you're in a forest with one big giant tree. Well, that's only one, but on that one tree, I might find that there are thousands of herbivorous insects eating it. So even though there's tons more primary consumers with only one producer, it works out because the size differential. So we can have inverted pyramids under special occasions, but definitely not in pyramids of energy. Energy is always going to decrease. It is not possible for energy to increase as you move from level to level. So at this point, you should be able to do the following. You should be able to calculate and explain the energy losses along food chains due to respiration and wastage. So remember that we can simply just say, well, if 10% moves on, the rest of it was lost due to usage by the organism through respiration. Some of it was not consumed. Some of it went to waste. You should be able to calculate and account for the efficiency of energy transfer between trophic levels. So if I give you two levels, can you calculate how much energy actually transferred? You can just divide how much moved versus how much was originally there and times it by 100. And then last but not least, represent food chains as pyramids of energy, numbers, and biomass. These diagrams of blocks that just show us how these things typically decrease from level to level. If you can do those things, great. And if not, as always, feel free to go back and rewatch. Thanks for watching.